call the meeting to order. The Cable Commission, and I guess I'm going to turn it right over
Do you wanna-
to
or do you
you
want me to just
for,
we have Counselor Wiley from Springfield on the phone with us today, and Tim Goodman from Comcast would like to make some opening statements. So if you'd like to start with that, or you can see if there are comments from the audience.
yes, I guess I didn't really work my way through the agenda,
That's
so
okay.
forgive me for that. I'm catching on. Now I'm catching on to my role. Can you hear me? Am I close enough to this? Yeah. Okay. Huh? Right. Okay, so first of all, on the agenda, are there any adjustments to the agenda? Assuming that we're fine on that? Okay. Do we have any audience members signed up to comment?
No, there are none signed up.
Okay, now we're back where we need to be. Thank you. And so I will now turn this over to you.
Okay.
Get us started.
So I'm Ann Davies. I'm an employee at LCOG and staff for the Metropolitan Cable Television Commission. We've been working on a franchise renewal and settlement of a franchise fee review. And Tim Goodman's in the audience today, and he's requested to present a short presentation to the commission before we get started.
That way you have a microphone.
All right.
Hi, Tim.
Good morning, I guess it is still. Glad to be back down in Springfield and Eugene. I think I was down here 3 times last week, 3 trips, and was here for the League of Oregon Cities Conference, and where we were sponsors, so it's nice to be here. I'll keep this really quickly. Don't have a whole lot to say other than, one, I would like to express my appreciation to your respective staffs from LCOGs, from Eugene, from Springfield, and Lane County as working on this franchise renewal and get us to where we are today. They've been very diligent, very professional, and great to work with. So I just wanted to express my appreciation for that. The second thing, wanted to express Comcast commitment to getting this done. I know we're looking at an additional extension, but we will work on our end to get it done well before that. So it would be nice to do that. So wanted to express my commitment in that regard. And the last little item is I left some, there's a couple brochures there. One, it just gives you some information on our community investments in the region, which goes from Longview, Kelso in the north down to Eugene, Springfield, Lynn County in the south. Also, a new brochure on our Internet Essentials program, which, if you're not familiar with that, that's a program where we provide internet for low-income families for $9.95 a month. It's been in existence for coming up on 8 years. We keep making changes to that, upgrades and so on. One of the things we've just added is the eligibility criteria where we've added low-income veterans to that program. And that was just made within the last 45 days, and so we're going to continue to improve upon that program. But again, I appreciate your time and look forward to continue working with your staff to get the franchise done.
Good.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Counselor Wiley, could you put your phone on mute? We're getting some feedback.
Here, sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, so as Tim mentioned, we've been, staff for all of the jurisdictions have been working together with Comcast to try to get this renewed franchise finalized. We've been working hard to get that done initially before August 1st, because the initial expiration date was August 1st of 2018, so a couple months ago. The jurisdictions scurried around to get an extension to that expiration date, and we were hoping to have a final franchise ready for you to recommend to the jurisdictions today. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. We're very close, but as I'll get to toward the end of the presentation, we're going to be suggesting that you recommend an additional 18-month extension, and Comcast has agreed to that as well. Before we get started, a lot of the staff are here for the different jurisdictions, and I know they're all eating and have their mouths full, but I would like to go around and have the staff that have been on this team introduce yourselves and who you represent. Is that coming in on her end?
No, that's. Got multiple phones going.
Christina, do you want to start?
I'm Christina Kraz. I'm the Assistant City Attorney for the City of Springfield.
Neil O'Brien from Springfield.
Christine Moody, I'm the county's budget manager.
Amber Control.
And I'm one of the assistant city attorneys for the city of Eugene.
Neil Moyer, Program Manager, Metro Television, Lighthouse Governments.
And Mike Streety, I'm with the Finance Division of the City of Eugene.
So thanks for doing that. I wanted you all to meet all of them. In my opinion, we have a great team that covers a lot of different areas. Hua has a lot of experience in the telecom area itself. Neil obviously is the Metro TV person, so with the technical expertise with regard to the channel itself. Neil and Christine and Mike are all from finance backgrounds, so that was really helpful in dealing with the fee review and a lot of the financial stuff in this. And Christina, Springfield City Attorney, is one of the smartest attorneys I've ever met. She just picks up stuff so fast. So we're really glad that she's on the team.
And
there you are. Great.
She didn't learn anything from me. Comes straight out of her head. We're just doing introductions.
Thank you for waiting.
Tim Goodman gave a presentation, just a brief introduction on Comcast stuff, but we haven't really even started in yet, so just introduce the local staff. So I did put together a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to dim the lights over here to make it a little easier to see.
Welcome.
Are we okay being in the dark?
Yes.
Yeah.
We are.
So to speak. And for the commission, please feel free to ask questions. I'm going to reel it back a little bit because I know there's some commissioners who haven't dealt with Comcast franchises before. There's some who are more familiar with franchising in general. So we'll go back and forth between kind of the more basic information, some more detailed. So no question is a stupid question, and I want to make sure everyone knows where we're coming from on all this. So this is just an outline of the presentation that I'm going to give today. I'm appreciative that we have this whole 2-hour slot to commit to the Cable Commission, because a lot of times we're at the end of the MPC and it feels like we're rushing through, but I really wanted to take this time to be able to answer questions, set the stage, and let the Cable Commission kind of know what we've been doing, where we're coming from, some of the background laws that apply, to help explain kind of where we are with some of the issues that have come up in the negotiations. So just a background, Franchising 101, some basic information about how these work, history of this particular Comcast franchise that we have in our area, get into the negotiations and what the big terms that floated to the top were, competitive equity, which is the one issue that's left out there that we haven't yet resolved, and then where we go from here. Okay, so Franchising 101, if you haven't been involved in telecom, there's all sorts of areas of this that can be confusing. I went to a presentation last week where a lawyer had said they went to their first franchising discussion and didn't know why city attorneys were talking about franchising, about McDonald's or, so there's different types of franchising, and we're talking about cable franchising, which allows the cable companies to put infrastructure in a city's right-of-way. And so I wanted to just basically start out with the premise from local government's perspective is the right-of-way is a public resource. It's held by the city kind of in trust for the people of the city. And so they allow its use for passage of travel, they allow its use for utilities, and stuff like that. So it's been a common understanding that this public resource, when you're allowing it to be used by private companies, the local government is entitled to some reasonable compensation for the use of that right-of-way. And that's kind of the basic premise that these franchise negotiations start with. Federal law with regard to cable companies has evolved kind of in its own stream, and I'll talk about this a little bit as we move forward. Federal law with regard to cable companies is different than federal law with regard to satellite companies is different for internet. So that's kind of makes things a little complicated when you're as we're trying to treat different companies equally, on equal footing, when they're not necessarily exactly the same. The federal law has capped the cable franchise fee at 5%. So when you're talking about franchises with cable companies, federal law says you cities can't charge more than 5% of their gross revenues, and that is the gross revenues that they're getting from providing cable services. So that cap applies to cable companies with regard to cable services. It doesn't necessarily apply to different types of businesses that are dealing with things other than cable services. So that's really important to understand when we're dealing with these different types of providers. And I threw a reference to the Consumer Protection and Competition Act because there's been a lot of discussion around, okay, if a provider comes in, like Comcast comes in, how do we make sure that another provider who's coming in later has a chance to enter the market? And so the federal government has decided to regulate and try to help foster competition among these providers. And so the cities, it benefits the cities as well. So that's something to keep in mind also as we talk about this. Okay, so the background of this particular franchise, and I think these dates are accurate. The original cable franchise was from 1989, and that was a 20-year franchise. Some very minor revisions were adopted in 2007. And so there was an ordinance that all 3 jurisdictions adopted in 2007 that made some pretty minor revisions. And it was at that point, they adopted a 10-year franchise, so 2007 to 2018-ish. And one of the provisions in that franchise was that the local government would be able to do only one fee review during that 10-year period. And because the local governments decided that they would only do one fee review, Comcast agreed to pay for it. There was some discussion later on about exactly what that agreement was, but we've settled on that there was one fee review, and Comcast, in this settlement negotiation, has agreed to pay for that fee review. Do you need me to talk at all about that, a fee review and how that works? No, got all that? Okay.
I don't know.
Okay, so what
I
it
don't know if
does,
I've got
in the
that.
franchise, what it does is you look at what gross revenues. You're looking at the gross revenues, and the cap of 5% is on the gross revenues from cable services. So because the local governments want to be able to make sure that Comcast is providing the right numbers, they can do a fee review. So we get a consultant on board to look at their numbers and make sure that they're reporting their gross revenues correctly, so that we know that the 5% that we're getting is actually 5% of the gross revenues. So in a lot of franchises, they're allowed to do them every 2 or 3 years. And I think the 20-year original franchise allowed every 24 months or something. I think a lot of jurisdictions are realizing it's a pain in the butt to do that, so it doesn't make sense to do every 2 or 3 years. So we just did the one during that 10-year franchise.
And the fee being reviewed is the fees that the cable company is charging customers. Is that the fee that's being reviewed?
The franchise fee is 5% of the gross revenues
Okay,
that they're
but
getting.
when you talk about a fee review.
Yes,
You're
the
just.
fees that they're giving us.
I see, okay.
Yeah, franchise fee is the 5%.
But based on
Based
what
on their gross revenues.
their gross
Based on
revenue.
accurate reporting of the gross revenue,
Yeah, there you go.
capped at 5%.
Right. So if they're counting this as gross revenues, and we think they should be counting this as gross revenues, that's going to be something that's looked at in the fee
Okay.
review.
And that was one of the issues.
Yes,
here.
yes, the
Yes.
bundled services, and I'll
Right.
get into that.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so with regard to, I wanted to go back. So the fee review, and I don't know the exact date, I want to say 2016 or something, that fee review was initiated. So LCOG put out an RFP for a consultant to do that review, and the review started, and we started negotiations around what their numbers came out to be. And then we got closer to the end of the franchise, and so we started the renewal. So those are the two things that are going on, settlement of that fee review and the renewal of the franchise. And so because they were happening at the same time, we combined them and started talking about them together. But they are really two different things that are going on. Okay, so that's when the negotiations started in about 2017 to renew the franchise itself. And staff came to the Cable Commission, this was before I was involved, but the commission directed staff to make minor changes. You know, we weren't gonna totally revamp the franchise, but basically tweaking stuff that needed to be tweaked for whatever reason. And then the fee review and the renewal negotiations got lumped together. So with regard to the fee review, I'm gonna pass out, I didn't have all of this ready for the time that the packet was due. But this is just an outline of where we are negotiations with Comcast on the settlement of the fee review. I threw in, we'll talk about this, there was an issue with the Springfield Library, and I think everyone here is probably familiar with what that was, but the $75,000 that Comcast is gonna pay to Springfield for closure of the Springfield office. And then the fee review itself, that Ashpond School Club, which is a consultant, charged $36,000, so Comcast has agreed to pay that fee. LCOG staff time initially during the fee review was $23,000, and Comcast has agreed to pay that in the settlement agreement. And then we basically split the baby on the underpayments. So there was the underpayments agreed to by Comcast plus half of the difference. And so that settlement is, we're pretty comfortable with that. That's what we are recommending the commission recommend to the jurisdictions to approve. We don't have that settlement agreement drafted or ready today. So I'm not sure whether, I had anticipated maybe scheduling another Cable Commission only meeting, but because that other piece isn't going forward, I think this can probably wait to the next MPC meeting in November unless staff has some questions about that. We haven't talked about that in great detail.
And these numbers have been negotiated with Comcast?
Yes.
They're agreed upon at this point in time?
They are, well, I don't want to misrepresent. I've sent the numbers, and I think their finance people are still looking them over, so we don't have like exactly, yes, we totally agree with these numbers. But the concept is the same. I've done my calculations and sent them over to Comcast, and if there is a discrepancy, it's within a couple $1,000s. Yeah.
But the agreement in principle to that there were underpayments and then plus 50% of the disputed amount.
Yep.
It's just a question of what exactly those amounts, making sure
Exactly.
we agree on what those amounts
Yeah,
are.
yeah. And I think we're working from the same numbers, so. And I will, you've seen this before, but it's not in your packet, so I'm gonna go ahead and send it
I
out
haven't
again.
seen it before.
Oh, you haven't seen it? Well, good thing I brought it.
This is my first Cable Commission meeting.
So this is the table, Counselor Surratt, that shows the Ashpond School Co's first report is on the left, and then Comcast's response to that is in the middle, and then Ashpond School Co revised their numbers a little bit.
Okay.
So these are the numbers that we're relying on, and we're all in agreement. So
Okay.
those are the numbers that we're using. Okay, so I want to move on to actually the key terms in the franchise that floated to the top in our discussions. In the packet of materials that you have is a table that I put together that shows, it starts out with the provision in the franchise that we're talking about, the provision number, and then a summary of what the issue is. In the next column, Comcast proposal, LFA, which is the local franchising authority, which is us, response, and then what the current status is at the very last column. So I'm not going to go through all of those. as I mentioned before, most of them have been agreed upon. The gross revenues was a big item of discussion. We think we've come to agreement on that, although until you have everything finished, we don't know for sure that we're going to want to back off of some other. You have it?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, that's
sorry, okay, got it. I do have it.
So I've discussed the gross revenues definition before. I can't remember, Councilor Surratt, if you were at the last meeting where that got
Well,
discussed.
no, there was some confusion, and I was told I didn't need to stay, and so I left.
Oh, okay,
That was
so,
my mistake.
well, let's talk about that briefly again. It never hurts to repeat it. So, as I mentioned, gross revenues is kind of the number that we're using. So in order to figure out our 5%, we need to have a gross revenues definition that we like.
Right.
And we did come to what we thought was an agreement. The Portland area franchise with Comcast has a gross revenues definition that we reviewed and looked at and decided that we thought was pretty good for us, that we could live with that. And then Comcast came back and wanted to add a provision dealing with the bundled services, the late fees on bundled services. So Comcast's position was that if there are late fees, those late fees, I always get confused of which way I'm going.
Well,
but-
yeah. I read the information, and I understand that the late fees aren't late fees just for the cable
Right.
provision. It's
Right.
for the bundled service.
Right. Ashpond School Code's position has been that those late fees aren't attributed to a particular service. So our position was that we didn't agree. I mean, we weren't agreeing with Comcast on how that should be treated, so we wanted to leave that language out and fight another day about it. And we decided, after talking with our financial folks, that it was reasonable what they were proposing. And so the proposal now is to actually have that language in that says that they're gonna allocate it to those different services.
Okay.
So that's what we're recommending
Okay.
on that. So services to institutions, we had, I was gonna write all my notes down on here because I'm losing track of what these different provisions were. So Comcast provides complimentary services to some of our anchor institutions. And what they've agreed to is to continue to provide those gratis services to the existing locations plus 3 additional buildings per jurisdiction during the franchise term, which we were very happy with. And then beyond those 3 buildings, the value of any of the additional buildings could be offset against the franchise fees. So the other ones wouldn't be, but anything beyond those 3 buildings would be. So a lot of these things we really did do a lot of back and forth on, and both sides kind of listened really well to the other side and considered what was reasonable, I think, and came to agreement on a lot of these provisions. PEG channels in HD is another one that is not totally ironed out yet. We were hoping to get all of our PEG channels in HD, and they've provided basically one channel, which we assume is going to be Metro TV in HD pretty much right away.
What does PEG stand for?
PEG is, I'm sorry, Public Education and Government.
Ah.
So basically Metro TV and LCC has a station. And how PEG is dealt with are almost always in cable franchises because they're parts of what the cable TVs provide to the local governments.
Okay.
And so what we were trying to get at was Metro TV getting that provided in HD, and then another channel that could, what we call proving up, as long as they have enough hours of original broadcasting, they could also get that in HD when they're able to prove up that many hours of original broadcasting.
So if I have DirecTV or some of the satellite service, I don't get government channels. I only get that if I have Comcast.
I think that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Comcast is the only one providing government channels to people who are subscribed to TV services?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that correct, Neil? Yeah. So we're,
Why is that? Why don't we make the others do that?
Because you haven't made them
do you want to, Neil, is that something that you are comfortable addressing, or?
No, it's a rhetorical question, never mind. Go ahead, continue.
It's things we've thought about.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes to his history of how this all evolved. I mean, cable's one of the older types of equipment.
And I'll go back to the history when David Kelly says AT&T has no, cable service has no competition. And I said, well, yeah, they do. So.
That's going way back, Pat.
Yeah, a lot of it's how it's evolved.
I'll go back further than that. When Nancy Nathanson and I were on the Council Committee on Telecommunications back in starting in 95, was when a lot of this discussion began.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
and I was saying the same thing back then, that, it's not a level playing field.
Yeah, well, and it's hard, well, we'll get into this a little bit because there's some new FCC regulations that they're trying to do one thing and they're creating an unlevel playing field. So it's hard to get everything that you want in one bucket. Even the FCC is creating an unlevel playing field because they're trying to get at other things.
Well, and always remember there's people that don't use any services.
Yeah.
Yes. You get what comes over the air.
Yeah.
And we don't care.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so, and then, terms addressing fee review, were, how many fee reviews are we gonna do? Who's gonna pay for them? How far back do we look in determining, what the numbers are we're looking at? So we think we're pretty much nailed down on that also, that we have an agreement that you can do a number of fee reviews, but as long as you're doing a fee review that's part of the performance review, in certain other conditions, then Comcast would pay up to $45,000 of that. And we think we're in agreement. We think Comcast has agreed to that as well. Customer service offices, the Springfield, in the previous franchise, there was a provision that said there's going to be an office in Eugene and there's also going to be an office in Springfield. The Springfield office closed during the term of that franchise, but the franchise itself was never changed to remove that requirement. We just said, okay, you can take it out, even though it's still in the franchise. So now we're taking it out of the franchise and we're saying, okay, there's only going to be a required office in the city of Eugene because that's where it currently is. And they wanted a possibility of coming back to the Cable Commission that says, if something changes in the next 10 years and we actually don't need that because everyone's doing stuff some other way, we don't need a customer service office in Eugene, we want to be able to come back to the commission and say, we'll take that out, that requirement out of the franchise. So we've actually agreed to that.
So, and that's why we agreed to do it, because we realize that even if you have equipment or whatever, that folks really didn't need to have equipment because they'll come pick it up.
Well, and you can drop it off at FedEx or wherever.
UPS.
UPS.
So there are enough options, not that for what most people would use it for. And if you have a phone, you just call people instead. So that's why we agreed not to have a Springfield offices. There's plenty of other ways to utilize their services.
Right. Okay. Did you want to say something?
No.
Okay. So competitive equity is kind of the big issue. So that's our sticking point. And I want to kind of talk about how we got here with the competitive equity piece. Changes in the landscape is kind of a lot of what I've talked about is that since 15, 20 years ago, there's different ways of viewing video on your TV. It used to be cable. Now it's internet and satellite and all these different ways. And we're trying to figure out how to make a level playing field, but it's not always realistic to do that. And part of it is, practically it's not realistic because they're doing different things, but part of it is that the federal law has evolved in different ways to deal with those different types of provision of services. Federal law, so the federal law, as I said, we've got the Cable Act, we've got the Telecom Act, and other interrelated federal legislation, and they've really tried to deal with competition. They've tried to make sure that competitors can enter the market where there's already somebody there. They've tried to require that local governments treat those providers fairly. And then the limitations on federal law, I just stuck in there because, as I explained before, that some of the laws apply only to cable services, and some of the laws apply only to different types of services. So you can't always treat every single provider exactly the same. Definitely our group, City of Eugene, Springfield, and Lane County, are going to work to attempt to provide that level playing field.
And may I, just a clarification on that, when you're talking about level playing field, you're talking about new people who would like to enter the market and use the right of way, as opposed to people who are not using the right of way?
Well, not necessarily. I mean,
Okay.
right of
So
way,
it's going both ways.
cable versus cable, right of way uses versus right of way users, right of way users versus non-right of way users.
Okay.
I mean,
So it is a comprehensive look at
I mean,
equity.
when we're looking at this, we're looking at all those things. This franchise agreement, I mean, that's one of the issues really we're getting at, is this is a franchise agreement for cable services. So there's only so much we can deal with in a cable franchise. We can't necessarily deal with the world. So,
And what I worry about is trying to make up with the fact that we can't deal with the world by doing what we can.
right, and so
We
we're
can deal
gonna,
with it.
we've tried to do as much as we can to avoid that, and I'll explain what the history of our negotiations were.
So this was something I did not think to ask city staff when we met with them yesterday, but in terms of our charge as a cable commission, there's gotta be limits on what we're even entitled to be discussing in
Yep.
terms of this.
There is, and there's a limit on you as the cable commission, there's also a limit on the jurisdictions, because the jurisdictions are the ones that are gonna adopt the ordinances. And I think they probably explained to you that the jurisdictions themselves are limited in what they can agree to.
Yes.
So you can't sign a franchise agreement that promises that you'll do something that the city does not have authority to do. And that's really what it comes down to. I just gave you the punchline to my whole argument there. So that's really what we've been trying to explain to Comcast as far as this competitive equity, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So these are kind of just bullet points of things that I've probably said already. The federal law does not require local governments to treat cable companies exactly the same as they treat like satellite, people who provide satellite services. There isn't anything in federal law that requires that. So the competitive equity provision that we got from Comcast was basically, would be us agreeing to abide by a contract provision that was beyond what federal law requires. So that's one part of it. The other part is we couldn't do it anyway because we don't have authority.
So requires or allows?
Would require.
Requires.
So, and the way the staff has tried to explain it is Comcast has these requirements. They have to franchise, but there's a cap on their fees. Certain things they have to provide, like PEG and stuff like that, are in the franchise. So say a satellite provider comes by, or, you know, the competitive equity provision that they gave us was actually wireline. So it wasn't satellite and it wasn't internet. It was something like, I guess, like Google Fiber, which isn't coming here. The reason I think Comcast was concerned about it is Google Fiber did try to go into Portland, and Portland, this is all just hearsay, but did kind of put out the red carpet for them, for Google Fiber. And, you know, we've said, verbally promised that, one, Google Fiber's not coming here, and two, we wouldn't do that. It's our interest in treating everybody the same. But that's just us saying that to them. So their concern is that some other wireline company is going to come in and be treated differently. So they're saying, well, if there's another wireline company that comes in, you need to treat us the same. And if you don't, then you need to lower our requirements to be what theirs are.
Could you just explain for me the difference between a wireline company and a cable company?
No, I can't. So that was what the issue came up, is like, okay, so if someone's coming in as a wireline company, wouldn't they be a cable, wouldn't they be a cable
Right.
services provider?
Right.
And we don't have an answer to that. We don't, who knows? 10 years from now, the technology might be such that something doesn't qualify as a cable services provider that is wireline, but in our vast expertise, we couldn't come up with it. So, and that's the thing, is we don't know what that competition is going to be. Go ahead.
But in the case of Google Fiber, it's a physical piece of infrastructure that would be laid in the city's right of way?
I think so. Pua, that's right, yeah.
So that seems to me for my new,
Yeah.
learning curve here, very close to
Right.
what we're talking about
Right.
with what Comcast has,
Right.
which is different from a satellite dish over which
Yes.
we do not own
Right, there's
the
no
right-of-way
right-of-way use.
for the satellite.
Right. So we just don't, I mean, I don't know whether it's been determined whether something like Google Fiber satisfies the definition of a cable services provider. If they are, then they would be required to get a franchise and do all the things that Comcast is, and they would be treated the same. So,
And that determination would be made by the FCC?
of whether they are,
Yeah.
is that right, Hula? Do you want to, can you come up?
We would be looking at the FCC interpretation. We would be looking at federal code of the definitions of what a cable operator, cable services, cable system would be. That's our franchise uses those definitions. So it wouldn't be actually the FCC making a specific ruling on this, but we would be looking at those interpretations.
Thank you. So, and back to your discussion that I think, Claire Surratt, you had with staff, is that under Eugene's ordinance, they cannot require franchising of providers that are cable. I mean, it just isn't allowed, even if it were allowed by federal law, it's not allowed under the Eugene Code. And Lane County doesn't have authorization to franchise other than through the Cable Act. So if you've got some hypothetical provider that is supposedly doing better off than Comcast is, and we can't bring them down to Comcast level because we don't have authority to regulate them, then all we can do is take away the 5% franchise fee that or whatever the obligations are for Comcast. So the result of signing on to their equity provision would be that we would be in the place of having to just nullify the requirements that we have for Comcast.
Right.
And so that's the concern. There's, legal implications to authorizing a contract that requires you to do something that you're not authorized to do. So the answer that we came up with was to provide an opener. So, if a wireline company or whoever it is that they're wanting to compare against came along, we would say, okay, Comcast, you can go back to the Cable Commission and the jurisdictions and figure out if there's a way that the jurisdictions can either change their codes or we can figure out something so that we feel like at least looking at it as a whole, that we're treating everybody fairly. So that's the last thing that we proposed to them is an opener like that. And the response that we've gotten back so far is that's not going to solve our problem. It's kind of like we must have this language and it has to be how, what we've proposed. So that's where we're stuck. It's just that, it's that one provision. The staff and, go ahead.
So presumably Comcast wants to renew this franchise?
Yes, and I believe that they do. I also know that they're pushing to get this addendum in a lot of other franchises as well. Some they have, some they haven't. We're kind of stuck because city's attorney and Springfield's attorney have said, we can't advise our electeds to sign this if it looks like that. Next steps. What we're recommending is to, again, bifurcate the fee review and the renewal and move forward with a settlement agreement that deals with the fees. Again, we don't have that ready. I could see a scenario where that gets done at an MPC meeting in the next month so that the jurisdictions can get that money back instead of waiting a year and a half to see that money. Extend the renewal negotiations for 18 months, which will allow us to review some FCC orders that came out last week that could impact how we negotiate, what's required of local governments, what's not allowed of local governments in relation to this franchise. And then I have here at the bottom, or initiate a formal process. So when you're negotiating with Comcast, cable company, you can go the informal route, which is what we've been doing for the last year and a half or however long it's been, or you can go a formal route, in which we could do now. The formal route is expensive, no one wants to do it, and I won't go into the details of explaining the process itself, but it is an option that we may want to consider moving forward. If Comcast is really saying, we're not going to sign this without this language, and our jurisdictions are saying we can't sign it with that language.
So, so how would the formal process help you get past that impasse?
Okay, so I took notes on, Christina has it in her head.
If you want to, I think we need to
Can you-
explain the formal process better. because
Christina,
Christina
can you come, do you have,
Well, who wants to, I prefer to her, but
Yeah, well, let's talk about the formal process, because I think it's worth hearing what that would entail. And, because we're gonna make a decision about how we're gonna go forward.
I'll let Hua correct me if I say anything that's not accurate, but the basic outline of the steps for the formal process is that it's essentially a trial-like procedure. It's not a negotiation type process. So it starts with a lot of information, reviewing a lot of information from Comcast about their current franchise operations, and the local governments making a proposed version of a franchise, which would probably be very similar to what the document we have now. And then there would be steps along the way of, the first step would be through a administrative law judge type official who would rule on the franchise. And then if that was not, then there would be an appeal from there up to federal court. And so the way that you approach the impasse is that it's not in the hands of two parties negotiating back and forth. It's more of a trial-like procedure.
Interesting.
who has something to say?
Yeah, any fries in the back?
No, stay right there. Christina, it is correct. I just wanted to maybe add a little bit in the beginning. We would put out a request for a renewal proposal for our franchise. We would look at what our community needs are. We would lay that out, and we would ask Comcast to respond to that, and they would let us know, yes, we could agree to this, we wouldn't agree to this. We would look at whether their proposal is reasonable or not. We would be asking for information if they said, we cannot provide what you're asking for because of economic hardship or whatever the reason may be. We would look at that, and I believe, would make a tentative decision on whether or not their proposal is reasonable, and then I think then it goes into the administrative process. And then if Comcast, if our decision to deny, if Comcast wished to appeal that, then it would go to district court, I believe, so. It's a very long process. I have never had any experience with a formal process. I don't know very many jurisdictions that go through that, but it does happen. Sometimes when you come to an impasse, that's how you have to proceed. But it is long.
Okay. Good. Other questions?
So, I mean, we have this point of contention, but it doesn't seem to me that we're at a hard impasse with this negotiation. And that process, in addition to being expensive, sounds like it takes some of the decision-making out of the hands of local jurisdictions and the parties involved.
It's possible at the very end that that could be the case with an administrative law judge or with a district court.
Yeah.
If our decision is upheld, I believe then we would be back at the table. But we would have starting out at a different standpoint with having a ruling on the proposals. There are a lot of variables, I think, to this.
Yeah. And we're not recommending necessarily that you advise the jurisdictions to go down that road at this point. One, we're advising the settlement agreement. Two, we're advising extension of 18 months. And during that 18 months, depending what happens, I mean, we could move into that formal process at any point. By saying no now, you're not saying no forever. And I could envision a scenario, you know, even a month down the road where we really are just saying, no, I need this, and no, we can't, that we're required to do that. But it doesn't need to be today. But by saying no today doesn't mean that we won't come back in a month or 2 months or 3 months or 6 months and decide that might be the right route. We just wanted you to know what the process was and that was an option.
Okay.
That was pretty clear, thank you.
Yes, thank you, that's much clearer. Can I ask a real basic question? What are the percentage of, and you may not know it, percentage of the households that actually use Comcast versus they just have streaming services or something on the
I don't
internet?
know. Tim, would you know the answer to that, or?
I think regionally, the number's typically around, for video, it's gonna be around 50%-ish, something like that.
50?
50, yeah.
50 is landline versus,
Yeah,
other.
yeah,
That it's physically connected.
right, versus, you know, direct and dish and so on. What we're seeing, the trends are, you know, our number of internet customers have now surpassed, or broadband customers have now surpassed video customers, you know, and that's just been the trend, and, you know, we're seeing, and actually, we're losing video customers at a slower rate than we were, but the broadband customers is accelerating, and it's going fast. This year, it's far more than we've had in any other previous years, so.
Keep the Pac-12 network.
That's the only one that I ever hear about too. As a Verizon user, they also are offering more extended services also for, you know, just when you're on the phone, trying to get something straightened out. So are you seeing other kind of providers that are?
Right, you know, yeah, you're seeing more and more as people are going over the top, you know, if you will, and, you know, with the, as you see the acceleration of like small cell and 5G, you may see a lot of people go that route as well, but then it's, you know, with 5G, they're still doing experimental tests on that, so I'm not sure what that even looks like. I went through a session a couple of days ago on 5G just to kind of get a better understanding of what it is, but basically they would be using your rights of way as well. But I'm not sure, quite frankly, how it all works, if you can even get it in-house or is this on a handheld device or whatnot, but that's going to potentially have some impact on video services down the road as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
And I was, because we're looking at a 10-year agreement, yes, and what all of the implications of that are. But I'm anticipating in 10 years, I mean, I can see some of the kids today going, I can't even believe you guys use those kind of services.
They do already.
Yes, they do already. So being one, I guess, flexible about, you know, how to work with the system that we still have, and knowing that, particularly for young people, that they don't necessarily have a physical cable connection. They do strictly streaming services. So you look at their TV screen that looks just like your phone screen. So, you know, how we go about doing this, so one, it's equitable, two, it's actually addressing the needs of the folks that are still using a straight cable the cable service is what my concern would be as we go forward with what a new contract would look like and into the future, because it probably will change significantly by the time that 10 years is up.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
So we have 2 votes to approve going forward with the fee review, and then a second vote to determine whether we are extending or not. All right? Any other conversations, discussions,
Can we put it in
questions?
one vote, or
put
it
it-
has to be 2 separate votes?
No, you can do it.
Oh, we can do it all
In one
as
motion?
one? Is that everybody comfortable with that, all as one motion?
Sure.
Somebody want to move to do that?
So moved?
Second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor of the fee review?
Can I have discussion for just one second?
Yes, you can, absolutely.
I apologize for being late. I was out at Food for Lane County. It took almost 40 minutes to get here from there. But Tim made a presentation from Comcast, and I apologize for not being here for that. So I've not heard where Comcast is on this. Are they in agreement with moving forward? Is that something that
They've
they would
agreed to an 18-year extension, 18-month, 18-month extension.
We're all happy.
Can you delete that from the record? Don't put that down.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
so they've agreed
this
to,
motion is,
and also to bifurcate and move forward with the settlement agreement.
and while there's still negotiation to take place, this is an amicable negotiation, and this is something that we're not, a while ago you used the word fight, and I think you said something that we didn't want to fight about, or we want to fight about. It was an inadvertent use, and I just, in the art of war, the best fight is one you don't have.
Yeah.
So I'm presuming there's no fight involved,
No.
it's a negotiation, across the
Yeah.
table negotiation, okay.
Commissioner Farr, most of my presentation was talking about how great your staff has been working. So,
Christine's my only staff here right now, so.
I can't, LCOG's in the other jurisdictions.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Ready?
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye. And Hillary said.
Thank you, Hillary. And opposed? Okay, it passes, and so we are good to go. Thank you
Thank
very
you
much,
all.
and I guess we're adjourned.
You know, one thing that I will say, and I've said this from 1995 on, is that I do see
Chris Valera, contact dispatch please. Chris Valera.
local jobs being created by people who are using our physical right-of-way. Not unlike when Home Depot brings their stuff in from Atlanta to compete with Jerry's that's local. They still use our right-of-way, and they pay to use that right-of-way. So, but they also have jobs. And I believe that Comcast is a part of our economic picture in Lane County. That they are a part of our strength in our economy. And for me, when we facilitate businesses in their ability to provide services to the people we live around, that's when we're doing our best job.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Counselor Wiley? Are you good? We are done.